Let's take a look at the Russian Revolution. So on the left there, we've got a picture there of Vladimir Lenin. And then on the right, we've got a picture of Alexei, the heir to the throne, and Tsar Nicholas II that we've already discussed. So, countdown to revolution. One of the biggest leading causes to the Russian Revolution is going to be World War I. So, in August of 1915, Nicholas II leaves and he decides he is going to supervise the troops in World War I personally. And so, as not only as the Tsar of Russia, he is also going to be giving specific instructions to his generals. And so when Russia starts to lose World War I miserably and they start to incur heavy losses, the people are going to blame the Tsar for this. And Russia does lose more people than any other country involved in World War I. These are some of the highlights. Nicholas II congratulating soldiers in the war, a little bit of propaganda there. So the countdown to revolution. So this is a political cartoon. In the background there, you see Rasputin, who was the advisor to the Tsar and the Tsarina. And it's almost like he's holding two little puppets, Tsar Nicholas II and the Tsarina Alexandra. And so it led to this very negative portrayal of the royal family that the Tsarina Alexandra had come under the sway of Rasputin. Rasputin claimed to be this healer or this holy man that could bring about a cure for the heir to the throne, Alexei, from hemophilia. So Rasputin is going to be hated not only by a lot of the aristocracy, but by the general public as well, as there is a lot of negativity facing the royal family. And so they start to rebel at Rasputin's access to the royal family and his influence on the war policies and on the government. So, what exactly brings about the 1917 revolution? So, we see a lot of cities and even rural areas that were facing severe hardships due to World War I. There simply was not enough food to feed the millions of people living in Russia. So, in March of 1917, the women decide to strike and they demand an end to the high prices and the rule of Tsar Nicholas II. And so Nicholas will at first send the troops out to fire on the crowd because of this heavy presence of these women demonstrators, very similar to what took place during the French Revolution back in the 1790s. And so the government falls. And so what happens is that Nicholas II, by March 12th, will be forced to abdicate. That means to give up his throne. And they will set up the first provisional government, which will not be very well organized. So the provisional government will actually be in power from March to May of 1917. And the initial plan is for a modern constitutional parliamentary democracy. And they wanted to bring in politicians from the upper classes. So a lot of your educated elite would likely be ruling the country. That doesn't sit well with the many peasants and industrial workers that weren't going to have any say in the government. And the biggest mistake that the provisional government made is that they stayed in World War I. People were sick and tired of soldiers dying. So neither group can control the peasants who hoard food, they seize land, they make shortages worse. And so it becomes a very tense-filled nation. This is a picture of Alexander Kerensky, who was a moderate, and he is going to be ruling Russia during the provisional government. When many of the initial leaders resign, Kerensky does step up, but he is threatened by this Bolshevik minority. The Bolsheviks were a rising communist group that was led by people such as Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, and they wanted radical change. They didn't care how they brought about communism in Russia. They didn't care how many people died, but they wanted to bring about change. And so Kerensky keeps Russia in World War I. He tries to go around and arrest Bolsheviks, puts them in prison, and many of them are forced to flee. So Vladimir Lenin will actually have to leave Russia for a short period of time. This shows you how terrible the fighting was. The military was instructed to fire on civilians. So this is taking place in Petrograd. So by November, quite a bit changes. There is a threat of military coup, and that forces Alexander Kerensky to release many of the Bolsheviks to defend the capital. When this happens, the provisional government and Alexander Kerensky is going to be discredited. There were numerous demonstrations that take place on November 6th and 7th that are going to force Alexander Kerensky and some of his top officials to flee. And that is all it takes for Vladimir Lenin to defend and gain control of Russia. So Lenin had lived in exile for many, many years. He had actually been expelled probably 20 years prior to the Russian Revolution. The Germans are going to allow Lenin and some of his top lieutenants to sneak back into Russia. And they enter Russia by way of Switzerland and Sweden by a rail car. And so Lenin calls for this overthrow of the provisional government. He's condemned as this German agent. And so while that is kind of being sorted out, he is forced to flee to Finland until his return. The Bolshevik cause. So Lenin, again, is going to proclaim this very simple campaign for peace, land, and bread. So to reiterate, peace, let's get Russia out of World War I, because it was a disaster for the Russian people. Land, he promises, I'm going to give you the land to the peasants and to the industrial workers. And then bread, he is going to feed the people. And so Lenin does gain quite a few supporters initially. The Bolsheviks eventually gain the majority. And then in October, Lenin is going to start leading the Bolshevik army, and they start to proclaim Soviet rule. By 1918, the Bolsheviks are going to fulfill many promises. So, first of all, in March, they are going to sign a peace treaty with Germany, despite the harsh terms. They are going to be forced to give up a large amount of Russian land. Russia will lose Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, and Georgia. So they are going to lose millions of people. Initially, Germany thought that they would pick up all of that land and rule it. But when Germany loses World War I, all of those areas are going to be set up as independent nations. So with these changes in the boundary lines, there are going to be major population shifts and as well as industrial changes. And so shortly thereafter, Lenin is going to begin to give power to the workers. He is going to turn over the factories to the workers and the land to the peasants. But there is a price to pay for those exchanges. This is a famous picture of Russian diplomats meeting to sign the peace treaty with the Germans. Because there are many people that opposed Lenin's policies, the Russian Revolution then turns into a Russian Civil War. So between 1918 and 1920, the Civil War takes place between the whites that are made up of the aristocracy and supported by the Allies. There were some Allied powers that hoped that the whites would remain in power. And then the Reds were really a much smaller but vicious group of people, and they were your anti-capitalist Bolsheviks that wanted to promote a communist government. The Reds see betrayal everywhere, and they try to spread revolution to Central Europe, where post-war instability makes it possible. So over time, the whole idea of communism will spread to Central and other Eastern parts of Europe. We will see that evolve a bit more after World War II.